Welcome to Beyond Sunday Morning Podcast, a sacred space to breathe, question, remember, and reimagine, where Monday through Saturday becomes a living prayer. I'm your host, Nordia, and here we explore the sacred that lives beyond the sanctuary, the everyday divine, the ordinary holy, the spirit in motion. This episode will sound a little different. A few sections were re-recorded due to audio issues, but the heart of the conversation is very much intact. Thank you for listening with care. Let's dive in. We're going to begin with a sacred pause with a deep inhale and exhale. And these words: let the words of our mouth and the meditations of our heart be acceptable upon our spirit in action, our Lord, our Creator, our Center, our Sustainer. I've had the pleasure of knowing Reverend Tabatha for quite some time, first through seminary and then as an intern at New Day Church, where she pastored. One memory that always stays with me is from 2019 when we joined an MTA protest together. Things got intense quickly, but Tabatha urged all of her congregants to show up anyway. And that night, we walked all through Harlem, feet on pavement, faith in action. Tabatha was one of the first people to expand my understanding of tithes, especially growing up in a Pentecostal church. And she taught me that tithing isn't just about money, it's about care, mutuality, and justice. And asking the radical questions like, why give tithes if you can't even afford your rent or groceries? Thank you, Tabatha, for being with me. So Tabatha, tell us about yourself. Who are you and how do you move through the world?
I'm Tabatha, she, they. I am a fourth generation minister from the Deep South, from Southwest Georgia. I often talk about that as a big part of my story. Growing up in the Deep South came with its blessings and its not so good things, right? And I am now seminary trained, $100,000 later. I have pastored a church. I have 3.5 units of CPE, which is clinical pastoral education, where I've worked in a hospital at the bedsides of all types of people in all types of scenarios, across age, across religious difference. And I currently work as I work with young adults in the Presbyterian Church that are discerning their call to ministry. And I do a little bit of community organizing still on the side. I work with Faith in New York and their restorative justice team. And we actually just did a wonderful training. So I'm excited to talk about that as kind of what I'm realizing is a life path of mine. And yeah, I write, um, I color, I read, um, and I seek the wisdom of the ancestors, which includes Jesus Christ. A little bit about me and how I move in the world. Yeah, yeah. Hmm. It's funny, I was at a job interview and I looked to somebody, they asked me where I was from, and I was just like, I'm from the country. I'm from like, a place where, there were a lot of dirt roads, right? And on those dirt roads were these little churches, right? Where, there was a hardwood floor, there's tamarines, and not a lot of times a musician. So it was just foot stomping, hand clapping worship, right? And so the way I think about my life and my call and how I experience spirituality, I think about that type of growing up, that type of organic worship where, our elders would line hymns. We would there was kind of just a way of communal life that was demanded of, I think, Black working class folks, right, in the Deep South. And there was a reason why the church was so central, I think, to our lives, right? And it was because our backs were against the wall. That Howard Thurman said that our backs were against the wall, and so I grew up around folks going through that, and went through it myself. And I just would say, So the good part about that experience is I feel like I'm deeply connected to my ancestors and a lot of their practices, their musical traditions, their ways of being. I think on the flip side, we took on a lot of aspects of white Christian supremacy because um because African traditional religion was stolen from us. Not only that, but the brutality of racism where we were just kind of demanded a type of subservient Christianity, right? Where people just felt beholden to a really oppressive God, a homophobic God, a transphobic God, a religious experience that was not expansive enough to see, liberation at the forefront, right? And so yeah, I would say that about growing up in the deep south is that on one hand I feel I remain deeply connected to my roots and my ancestry. And on the other end, the brutality of slavery and the history of lynching, the history of Jim Crow, the history of racial segregation, and the trauma that my people kind of carry translated into their religious experience, into which the religious experience became one of.
I'm so curious to hear how you parse this experience of Afro religion tradition as a body practice. Because to just call it Christian doesn't capture the fullness of what you named, of the clapping and the stomping, the speaking in tongues, the running around because your body is on fire, and doesn't know what to do with that excellence, right? We have to get it out. So for you, in holding that, what was that process like? How did you parse through it to find liberation and your own interpretation of the divine outside of the oppressive lens?
So I will say when I got out of high school and I got to college, I decided I wanted to be active in chapel. I decided I wanted to continue to, be rooted and committed in my faith. And I went to Spelman College. So it just so happened that Spelman College chapel was unlike any chapel in the world, right? Complete run by Black women. I never forget I had a peer that said that this is the only place where this is a space that is just run by Black women in terms of programming, in terms of who we center in the preaching experience, in terms of who we center in terms of the worship experience. This is about the relationship that Black women have with the divine, and this is a place where we get to cultivate that with a certain type of liberty and freedom. And so I think that was kind of the beginning for me, right? I was a chapel assistant and I lived actually in a house on campus called the Wisdom Center. So it was wisdom is women in spiritual discernment of ministry. And so we spent a lot of time, reading the work of Audre Lorde from a theological lens. Like we spent a lot of time reading about womanist theology. We spent a lot of time reading about, sexuality and the Black church, right, by Kelly Brown Douglas. We spent a lot of time just thinking about and parsing through different parts of the Black religious experience that really spoke to the liberation of Black women. So that was kind of my start, I would say, and that was a wonderful place to start. It just goes from one thing to the next. I did that. I was in college during the time that Trayvon Martin was killed. I was there at the time when Michael Brown was killed. I was there in the time when Eric Garner was killed. So I think all of us millennials that were in college in that time can all speak to the ways in which our lens on freedom and liberation and organizing was shaped by those critical moments, right? So that was also a big part of it for me, right? Is having to believe that despite what the state was doing to us, right, that God still loved us, that God still loved our flesh. So, I did all the college stuff. I went to India and I got to experience different religious traditions. That was eye opening for me in terms of understanding the different names of God and the different ways and traditions that people engaged in their faith. So I always talk about going to a Sikh temple. And that was kind of like I was going there like multiple times a week, actually. And I just would watch I would watch thousands of people across caste sit on a floor together, hardwood floor together, and share a meal, which was just rare. I mean, it was really rare because caste is such a thing. And I remember I came back, I was like, I think I'm called to ministry actually, because the Christian tradition has a lot to think about, right? And I want to be able to think alongside of it, right? As we define God and what does God require of us. So yeah, I mean, came back home from studying abroad. Thought I was gonna go for a PhD program, applied to just Union, nowhere else. I wanted to study Black liberation theology under James Cone. So I came here, and I think the rest is history in terms of, what it means to come to a seminary that is queer affirming, right? To come to a place that is welcoming of people of all faiths, right? To be in dialogue and conversation with just some of the best cutting edge, religious scholars in the world. That all of those pieces were big informative in terms of me liberating myself. God, what are you asking us to do? What are you asking me to do specifically? Right? Because these are hard questions. These are really hard questions. I think I mean that specifically because we were just talking about what does it mean to be women or to be femmes, to be queer folks in this line of work, because this is our professional work, right? We're not just going to church and doing the church volunteer work. Like this is what we paid a lot of money to practice, right? And so when you say, or people say, what is God calling me to do? Well, God is calling me to stand, right? And to stand on the side of liberation, but I still have to pay my bills. I still have to eat. I still have to feed my cat. I still have to, take care of family responsibilities back in the South, right? And so the question is, what is God calling me to do? And how can I move in alignment with that and be in my dignity? How can I contribute the gifts that God has given me in an authentic ways? Right? How can I do this work and be my full self and not have to leave any of myself at the door? How can I do this work? We were talking about chaplaincy, right? I mean, I'm at 3.5 units. The other question is, if God is calling more of us to be spiritual companions to people, right? Then God is going to have to answer the question of how do we sustain ourselves when we do that work? Right? Because it is hard work. It is hard work. And so, the question is like, yeah, God, what do you want me to do? But God, like, what do I need in order to be able to sustain this work? Right? What does it mean for me to be able to do this work and receive my portion? Right? So that's what comes up for me when you ask what is God calling us to do? I mean, in terms of the church and in terms of, the broader, religious experience, that's clear to me. God is calling us to be on the side of the marginalized and the oppressed. But I mean, that question lands differently for me personally, right? It lands differently for me as a religious professional. We do. And I think this is an interesting conversation because, what we know to be true, I mean, let's just keep it a buck, right? Not all of our peers that in this work are dealing with the same questions. They're not all of our peers are asking themselves, what is God calling them to do and how is God calling them to do it sustainably? We have a lot of peers that are, they experience white privilege, right? They experience heterosexual privilege. They experience just the privilege of being in bodies that the church deems more accessible and more acceptable, I would say, right? To do the work that the spirit is calling for. And so a lot of those people they're not worried about where their next meal is coming from. I mean, let's just be honest, there are churches, that offer livable wages, right, for the people that work on their staffs. There are even Black churches. Whereas, ministers are paid well and are treated, with decency and with dignity, right? Do they want our work? I can't, sometimes like I can't speak to that. Right. I almost said it's the ghetto, but I had to stop myself because I have to say it actually is a calling. It actually, I mean, it is a calling. And I think my time in seminary, I was clear that I wanted to study practical theology, right? I wanted to know about, how do you design a Bible study? How do you write a good sermon? How do you preach a good sermon? How do you create a strong worship service, right? And how do you build the life of a congregation? And so I think by the time it was I was ready, right, to pastor that church, or, it was time for me to start, there was there was genuine excitement and curiosity about what it meant to be 25, in a new borough, in a new place, um, on a, not so good salary, right? Um, Coming into a church plant, that had a founder before I came in. But also coming into a place with such radically different theology than any other place that I'd ever been to. And so that felt like something that I could work with. That felt like something that would make my job a lot easier, even as it relates to building, like I said, the life of the congregation and thinking about the life of the congregation. So I knew I wouldn't have to go too far outside of myself to keep the doors open, if you will. And so we talked about the tithing conversation. We talked about the fact that New Day was a place where before the pandemic, we were already, our church had already voted on going in the direction of mutual aid. Right. So we, at first, the church would send 10% of its money to a community organization. And then, we had, some members of our church said we need to study mutual aid because that's what our movement people are doing. And maybe there's a way that we can adapt this that works for us, and shows us the ways that we can show up for each other. So I mean, it was really impressive to me that I was in a space that was so open to a concept that was new to churches. And then by the time COVID came, we had somewhat of a structure in place and some shared language of understanding what that meant and what that would look like, and we were able to use that pot, right, to take care of our people. And that was one of the blessings of being a part of New Day Church. So I will say, like, I think about mutual aid and, all the other wonderful things we were able to do because the church was so open and so full of leftist progressives, folks in the city that were already, at the heart, at the center of our movements. So that felt good. That felt like, I'm in alignment. I'm in alignment here. And the flip side of that reality is, COVID was COVID, and COVID also was an unveiling, right? It was a moment where all churches had to reevaluate, right? If what we were doing and what we were bringing was ever sustainable, to be honest. Because, you and I both know you were an intern at New Day. I mean, we all know, you coming, you're trying to, you're trying to be in this church plant, and the church plant is in a school, which means you have to break down, you have to sit up, which means you got to have volunteers. You are part of a church plant, you don't have a lot of money, so you got to get creative about how you want to do fundraising, but you don't want to use certain oppressive theologies to get people to give, right? You want to think about, how can we be at the forefront of, the liberation movement as people of faith, right? That are in the conversation, right? But how do you do that in a way that is different from leaders of faith in the past, right? What we call the Black misleadership class, right? That Black male religious order that comes in and just takes over stuff, right? So all of these things kind of made it, I would say, and then you add to COVID, it added to the challenge of that, right? Because it was like, do we have capacity to be on the church that shows up in the streets and the church that, provides resources to single moms and trans people and folks that are affected by climate disaster? Do we have capacity to do all that and also care for our elders, right? And find child care for our children, right? And it just it was all these questions kind of came up. And then when it was time to go back, I remember I had I had a profound sense of dread because I knew that given what was happening before COVID, right before COVID, I already began to see, that what we were doing was not sustainable. People were burned out. Um, the infrastructure was just not there, and I think that was the case. I'm not speaking specifically about my church. I think that was a complicated. Those are complicated questions to ask, right? When like I said, when I was coming on, the church membership was already kind of dwindling, right? We had been having the same volunteers kind of coming and they were starting to get burned out, right? So it was like, what's your strategy as the Black queer preacher pastor here to up these numbers, right? So that we can continue to go on. We're coming right after a white male leader here, and there needs to be excitement, there needs to be momentum, right? And so I think COVID, it slowed me down in some powerful ways, for me to be able to reflect about what my capacity was. Just the work of running a church, the work of being a part of a liberation based church is not easy. You don't get the same givers, I guess, benefits, right, of those churches that choose the side of empire, right? We need to hold each other accountable, kind of, because we need somebody to come out here and put out the chairs. But also, again, this is not your grandmother's church, in a sense of I'm not going to beat you upside the head and guilt trip you to get you to come and volunteer. It's very simple. If you want this body to continue, it is what we make it together. It's the real flip side of building of building any community, like even political homes, right? There has to be, there's this, I'll never forget, there was a word that one of our members was an organizer, and they taught me the word absorption, right? And absorption is where there is a defining moment happening, defining political moment, right, where everybody finds a home to go to. So say it was for New Day, I would say, even I would never forget COVID. Before COVID, we were down to maybe about 30 people a Sunday. And then I remember on the first day of COVID, it was our anniversary, and we had like 100 people. So as far as I'm concerned, COVID was the absorption. It was the space where people were like, thank God I can come to my church and I don't have to get up and go all the way to the Bronx. If I live all the way in Queens, or I don't have to worry about sit up and take it down. I don't have to worry about feeling guilty, right? If I'm not doing my assigned roles or duties, right? I don't have to feel guilty if, I need to leave early because I got a date to go on, right? These are just practical matters and things to think about for anybody trying to build any kind of community, but especially a church, and especially, in the context of the church declining in growth and in attendance and in money and resources. Yeah. But in terms of it's funny you mentioned the house thing, because right after when COVID restrictions began to lift, the model that we adopted was the model of house church. And for me, that was exciting because a lot of members really were like, we need our own building, we need our own space. The previous pastor, he vehemently disagreed with that. And I was indifferent about it. I was like, whatever, a space is a space is a space. We might have to co-rent it. We might have to do whatever the case may be. But what I loved about when COVID restrictions lifted was this concept of house church. And it reminded me, it felt like we were living in the New Testament. It felt like we were, inviting people into your home is a vulnerable thing to do. Inviting people into your home to pray, right, is a vulnerable thing to do. And I think that, at that point I was like, we can get this house church thing. We can get this house church. I like this house church thing, right? Because it breaks us out of isolation. It gives us a chance to gather. We don't have to worry about pulling out 1,500 chairs. We don't have to worry about setting up a home. They're literally, the band can play from one house. There is not so the way and the ways in which COVID made us be creative, I think was a wonderful possibility for us to think about what was next, right? But by the time we think about what was next, I wasn't there anymore. So That's another conversation, man. I don't know, and I don't know, and I don't know if people are listening to this and are part of a church and are thinking like, church can't sustain, and it's just like, listen, like, we've got to be innovative. We got to think creatively about how we do church and how we do spirituality, how we do spiritual practice.
Curious of how does your spirituality shape you as a person? And more particularly your identity, because as a Black queer femme, the experiences of how we name the divine and experience the divine in the world and the conditions that we're under are particularly lifted through how we see our own embodied experience. So I'm curious, what was your process? How do you embody your spirituality and your identity as a Black queer femme together?
Thank you for asking the question about embodiment, because I have, being in my body is very important. It has become a very important practice. I've always been I've never been a person that has a one track spirituality. Like, even when I had gotten out of high school, I went to college. I kind of started going to see the ladies that would read out of a book to you. Right. I had already started doing that. I was like, there are questions that I have, and there are no answers that are written in the Bible. I'm praying, and God is not giving them to me. I need another medium to help intercede for me and support me in, what is happening in my life journey. In my discernment around what is God calling me to. So, I started, like I said, I've never had a one track spirituality anyway. So starting from that place, going to seminary, seminary was, I don't want to get too deep into it, but seminary was a hard time in my life. Seminary literally felt like a hazing process. So Professor Cone, he got cancer again, and he passed while I was there. And then the same semester, my mom got diagnosed with the late stage cancer as well. And I was often back and forth from Union to Georgia and back again, in my time, just trying to be at the bedside of my mother who was dying, and exegesis, right, in the era of 45, right, just coming in to office and power. So that was my time in seminary. And in terms of, I would say, my spirituality was, it was in question. My spiritual practices were shifting, they were changing, because I needed practices that could ground me in my reality of watching my mother die, of watching the institution shift, right? And what did it mean for Union to be Union without Professor James Cone? What does it mean to be a Black student on Union's campus without James Cone? Right? I needed practices that could speak to all those things. And so I started doing a little bit of work, a little bit of spiritual practice, actually, around like altars. I'll never forget that in seminary. I was like, I know that our people did communion. So, which means they did a special setup on Sunday mornings, right? I know that Black people's homes, where I was from, in the South, in South Georgia, a lot of Black people had dens. I don't know if you're familiar with the den tradition, but nobody has dens anymore. But the dens were, I mean, I'll never forget, I had a ex one time that said to me, dens are like Black people's altars. It's where all of the pictures of their ancestors are. Nobody goes in there. It stays dark. It stays quiet. Every now and then they might go in there and they might light a candle, right? And these might be staunch Christians, but literally they know that they are uplifting their ancestors in their homes, right? And so I was like, when I started doing some of my projects in seminary, exploring the different facets of worship, I started getting really experimental in terms of what might it mean for me to set up an altar. Right. I said, what might it mean for me to set up an altar for Black women? What might it mean for me to arrange a table with purple cloth and honor those that are a part of the womanist tradition? What might it mean for me to bring in my great grandmother's quilt, right? And think exegetically, think theologically about her making this quilt in the context of the lynching, the time of the Reconstruction era, right? What does it mean for me to think about, all of these different kind of indigenous and Black practices that remind us of what our ancestors did, right? And can hold us, sustain us, keep us alive until tomorrow, right? So I think I'm still, in terms of that journey of spirituality, I still remain, yeah, kind of in that dual practice. I still pray to Jesus, our liberator, especially in times of trouble. I will still sing Jesus keep me near the cross now. I'm not too good to hear, part of me, I mean, like the womanist part of me, when I needed to, the blood of Jesus gives me strength. Jesus cover me, when I needed to now. When times get rough, I know who to call. I know how to call, I know it, but at the same time, I'm always working to expand my practices and to discover and explore any practices of my ancestors that have kind of been untapped or undiscovered or unexplored. Yeah, and that ranges from tarot, right, to it just ranges for me, the ways in which I try to engage my spirituality and the practices, because I'm realizing that I need some type of tangible. I need something that's tangible, something that I could touch, something that I could work with my hands. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but terms of, and the embodiment piece is really important, right? I think we talk about that often, around how a lot of, charismatic Christian tradition tells us to separate the spirit from the flesh and to ignore our bodies and our bodily desires and blah 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 blah. And I'm just like, no, at this point, that is a big part of how I stay grounded in the world, spiritually even, right? Is I have to get connected into my body. So, you chose yoga. I've done a bit. I love doing yoga, first and foremost. I don't do it enough, but I will say, about a year ago, I got into the work of politicized somatics. So country that work kind of do this work, and there's an organization called Generative Somatics. Yep, we got the Strozzi Institute, right? We have a lot of practitioners that came out of Generative Somatics are now training movement leaders and organizers and spiritual workers, right, on how to be grounded in our bodies as we do this really radical work. So I started doing that about a year ago, and it has been life changing, right? To connect to my center, right? And to access, there's certain language they use around, being able to access more options when you're under pressure, because I didn't know how to breathe.
Yeah, and we're the same. The embodiment, right? That's why I practice yoga, because I needed something that helped me work it out in my body, to know I wasn't wrong, to know you see this, you see what's going on around us on this land, and the experiences that one is having. And it's not about throwing away Jesus. That's not what we're doing. But we're adding to the ways in which we can see Jesus, divine spirit, walking alongside us, right? Opening up our rearview mirror to see more. But like you said, in your trip to India, you observed so many different names for the divine, because if we're honest, there's so many names. And I'm just grateful hearing you talk about it, because you're saying it in a way that feels like it's always been there, right? It's nothing new. And so I am wondering, what has that experience been like for you? What new perspective has it given you on how you see the body, or how you understand yourself in a spiritual community?
Yeah. 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 God is God. God gotta be God. Gotta. I gotta locate God in this body. Um, and if that comes by way of an embodied practice or meditation that brings me into my body, or if it's pleasure, right? Experiencing good things, experiencing things that feel good, that make me feel good. That can look a whole bunch of different ways, but I gotta have, because I spent too long, right? Due to that kind of white Christian supremacy, neglecting my body, not being in my body, not feeling into my body, not honoring my body as the temple, right? That they say that it is. Ignoring my pain, right? Ignoring so much, right? That was just so essential to a spiritual life. So yeah, absolutely. And New Day was, I mean, pastoring the church I pastored was powerful and wonderful because we talked about bodies all the time. We were doing embodied practice all the time. We were doing deep breathing and worship. There was no nothing witchy about that. Witchy to ask people to breathe, right? It's not witchy to ask people to engage in embodied practice, right? There's a freedom. There's actually a profound freedom in getting to I actually did my spiritual reflection on Intozaki Shange's quote. I found the God within me and I loved her fiercely. And I think about that when I think about embodiment. Because there's also a bunch of contradictions of the church in that. Because I'm like, how do you not believe in practicing embodiment, but then you believe in the Holy Spirit literally falling on bodies and bodies passing out? How are you disembodied or encouraging people to be disembodied and literally some outward force comes into the space, touches the tongue, and the tongue starts to speak in a different language? Like the spirit comes by way of our bodies. It's just, yeah. So
And I have one last question. As we are wrapping up, I also know that you are a death worker, and I am curious about the ways in which you've had to be in relation to different bodies, and also the ways in which to be with a body that is transitioning from living, but transitioning into a different way that is filled with uncertainty, that is filled with, fear, and also a culture that I would say we don't have a really good relationship with death. So, yeah, what is that like? Bring that into the space.
yeah, thank you for that. There was I've been actually my practice just it's always about ongoing study, right, and development. And one of the, I would say, experts, the grief experts that I've been really listening to a lot is Malkia Dixon, and they are powerful organizer coming out of the Black Panther tradition, and they've been on a couple of podcasts, and the topic of their conversation has been about grief and about what does it mean for our movements to take grief seriously and to integrate grief in the work, right? Because grieving is often what brings us into organizing. But so then Malkia a couple months ago talked about being in connection with a body that was in its transition, but had experienced just a range of feelings, right? Like I said, from pleasure to pain to all the things in between. And so when I approach or I am in proximity to people's bodies, I consider all of that. I consider the last time they danced. I consider the last time they made love. I consider the last time they got on a roller coaster. I consider the last time they touched water, the last time they experienced body of water, the last time they experienced play, right? The last time they experienced joy and laughter in an embodied way, the way in which they got to move in their bodies on this planet, in this realm. Even for those who, my favorite group of people to work with at the bedside actually are people who are sex workers, use drugs, are HIV positive, because their lens on life, just for me, it expands my theology, particularly as it relates to indulgence and pleasure in this era, in this state of the world. I think about how do they have to care for their bodies in order to stay alive? And that is a particular type of embodied wisdom, right? To have to nurture oneself and to think about one's practices in a way that reduces harm and keeps one alive right now when we know that the batches of heroin they're poisonous right now. Like we know that, our people are dying right in the throes of addiction, not because they deserve it, but because they have found a way to be free in this world that oppresses them. And I'm talking about, I'm a harm reduction. I study, that's another big piece of my work. I study harm reduction, even as a death worker, right? In this time of so much death and so much destruction and starvation. We're watching starvation on our screens right now. Come on, like, so you talk about like what does it mean to see the dying, to be with the dying, to witness the dying. I try to be with them and to help them remember and imagine all that they felt and experienced in this life and to be present. My prayer, if my life were a living prayer, it would be Spirit, meet me and help me clarify what it is that you want me to do this in this time. It would be Spirit, support me in identifying what gifts you want me to use right now for in service of liberation. What are sustainable ways, right, for me to show up in this work that allow me to preserve this body and this spirit? That's my prayer. That's my living prayer. I want to be your sanctuary. I need this sanctuary to be alive. I need this sanctuary to be healthy. I need this sanctuary to have mental clarity. I need this sanctuary to address this. I need this body to be in honesty around the pain it experiences. I need this body to be cared for, to experience pleasure. I need this body to experience all of that. So yeah, that's my prayer. Talked a lot about embodiment. Wow, it's interesting.
Thank you so much for joining us for this week's conversation. I hope it offered you something to carry into your own living prayer. Until next time, may you breathe deep, rest well, and notice the magic in your Monday through Saturday. And now, as a gift from me to you, a short practice to take with you for your week is, as you are ready to take a shower or bathe, meditate on all the ways in which you are releasing the day, releasing the worry. So naming it. I am releasing the person that bumped into me on the subway. I am releasing all of the stereotypes that it placed onto me. I am releasing, and just visually watch and feel as the water touches your skin, all the ways that you are releasing. Until next time, friends. Bye.